I'm so sorry to be in such a. I feel in quite a reflective. The difference between reflective and reflexive. Reflective, I'm thinking about things. Reflexive, I'm thinking about how those things impact on you. That's it. I think I am being reflective, not reflexive, but I may be reflexive as well. Who knows? Maybe somebody can analyze the difference between those two words if I've got it wrong. But I'm feeling quite reflective this evening. I fell asleep and I was terribly tired. Um, and I can't say that I was dreaming of the Prime Minister. I wasn't really aware of what I was doing for a good hour or so. And um, but I was thinking about the things which have been going on in the last couple of days. And I'd like to give you my thoughts about the Prime Minister's speech yesterday because it seems to me to have been very ill considered. Not the only ill considered thing that Mr. Sunak has done recently, but I think it is. I think he was badly advised to do this. I don't think there is a national emergency. If there is a national emergency, it's very ill defined by Mr. Sunak. I think this is a confection to try and stir up a national emergency. I mean, if you put this next to what the Speaker said the other day, yes, there is concern, but there's been concern for some time, and I don't think that the timing of this is anything other than a moan about the fact that the Conservatives lost the by-election in Rochdale, and George Galloway, this uh, heavyweight orator, has now returned to Parliament and will make life difficult. But he will also make the debate more interesting, and that is something that is necessary. George Galloway doesn't do uh, the pointless recitation of slogans. I mean, he is a sloganizer, but he will answer a question, and he is thoughtful in the way that he gives his answer. It may not be the answer people want, but he is always interesting. And I mean, he's not he doesn't advance my ideas at all, but he advances ideas, and that's good. And he's not afraid of being seen with the wrong sort of people. I think um, his cat lapping activities in Big Brother were embarrassing, and and I thought at the time he would never surface again as a reputable, realistic, or serious politician. I was wrong, and I'm sorry to have been so misled. But I was misled. I judged in haste. I do that often, and I'm perfectly happy to hold up my hand if that's the case. And in the case of George Galloway, I'm sorry. I misjudged him. And there is life after licking out uh, a uh, a cat bowl, um, and I would never have imagined that possible. But it it sticks, doesn't it? It just doesn't work for an unelected prime minister to be criticising, even in a sort of slanted way, a man who's just been elected in what, by all counts, must be a free and fair election and by a hefty majority. And the Conservatives well and truly lost. There were other issues which I think are worth drawing out. That one of the candidates, Danjuk, received death threats. That is worth drawing out, and that's worth considering because there's a general election coming. And yes, from that point of view, I can understand the Prime Minister standing on the steps of Number 10 and saying this, but uh, I think the threat is no bigger last night than it would be on Monday, and I think the place to have made that announcement, the place to have said that, was in a statement to the House in Parliament, not on the steps of Number 10. And I don't think being on the steps of Number 10 uh, helped the case, and I think, if anything, it cheapens that moment. He talked about a rise in extremism. He talked about extremism threatening to trying to tear us apart. Our streets targeted by small groups. Well, those small groups include the small groups that rally around people like Suella Braverman, Jenrick, Lee Anderson, Liz Truss, as well as the Islamic extremists. He was quite happy to talk about Islamic extremists and the far right as concepts, but all his examples were drawn from those people who were on marches. And I think that's misunderstanding the threat. I think that's misunderstanding the problem. And I think that's trying to silence the democratic right of people to march. And that cannot be right. I think Keir Starmer is right in praising the context of the speech, if not the delivery and the content. And Ed Davey condemned the speech. I would want to do both. I would want to praise the context, rather like Keir Starmer. The context is that this is becoming a more dangerous place for politicians. But the content was ill-advised, partly because I think the Prime Minister thought he could score a hat-trick and get rid of those people who were questioning the government's approach to Gaza. And were and I think he was wrong. I think he was wrong. I think the government is fast coming to the same position I have tried to steer, which is that the government of Netanyahu is misguided. But I think they were misguided from the very beginning. There isn't a point at which you say, oh, this is enough deaths. There isn't enough deaths. One death is enough. There isn't a point at which there isn't a calculus of fatality that is acceptable. One death is unacceptable. So you can't say, oh, you can keep fighting until this point. Once war begins, it's an end in itself. We shouldn't even have the war. And if you're going to have some sort of righteous fight, a just war, then the more people, the more nations who are behind that, who are linked in that effort, the better. If it's a defensive war, it's a different matter. Zelensky is entirely at liberty and right to defend his country. Zelensky adopts the Churchillian position. I don't think he did it early enough. But his act of going out into the street for just a few seconds, really, while there were assassination squads running around the place trying to take him out, was an act of extraordinary bravery, but it made the point very clearly that this was a man who was going to lead his country in a fight back against Putin's intended, very quick military coup. Now, of course, it's turned into war, and it's turned into a bloody war, and it's turned into an unrelenting war, and that's appalling. But that was the decisive moment. And Zelensky was right to defend his homeland. That's not actually the position that Netanyahu has taken. Netanyahu is right to defend his homeland. But the invasion of Gaza, in the form it took, even the aerial bombardment by one single nation against a trapped civilian population, it's not quite defending your country. To go after Hamas, absolutely. But to go after Hamas underground, in the network of tunnels that were created in Gaza, that requires a much more targeted and a much longer campaign, and Netanyahu knew that. Now, my argument has always been that with particularly support from the Arabic countries surrounding Israel, a ground offensive in Gaza would have been significantly more successful with that support, and would have been significantly less fatal to the civilian population. And indeed, I think would have the support of the Arab neighbours would have guaranteed the return of the hostages, and may indeed have catapulted the region into a serious reconsideration of the two-state solution. Netanyahu's response was to jettison all that diplomacy, all that effort, all the goodwill which was pouring out in October, to jettison all that in favour of trying to salvage his own political position and to present himself as a war leader and the champion of his country. Netanyahu has become a byword for disaster. He has become as much a tyrannous leader as any other tyrannous leader. And I don't even need to mention Mr. Putin's name, but Mr. Netanyahu, I think, has gone over the edge. And it wasn't about how many people he killed, it was about his decision to go it alone in a ground offensive, which can only have one consequence, and that is the death of many, many, many civilians, and the provocation and the encouragement of terrorism. He has acted as the single greatest recruiting officer for Hamas, or whatever follows Hamas, in much the same way as our offensive in Iraq acted as a recruiting officer for ISIS, and in much the same way as the various battles in the various wars in Afghanistan bred the Taliban. If you're going to go into a country, you go in with a clear objective, and you sit it out until that objective is accomplished. There isn't a point at which you say, it's enough. To give up is to make a mockery of the people who have died. You know that this is going to be a ghastly experience. And I think Netanyahu made the wrong call, absolutely. Just as I think Putin made the wrong call, absolutely. So Netanyahu should pull back. Putin should pull back because they made the wrong call, not because there's a point at which there's too many deaths. They just simply need to recognize they made the wrong call. In the case of Putin, I regard Putin as fundamentally moving over, or I think I regard him as fundamentally moved over to the dark side. I regard Netanyahu as potentially salvageable, but I think probably not. I'm sorry if I give the impression that I see things in terms of good and evil, but I do. Sometimes I'm wrong. Sometimes I'm wrong. And I think that the Prime Minister got it wrong, seriously wrong, yesterday. And I think there is a serious problem developing. I think he's called it out in the wrong terms. He's called it out in terms which he hopes will give him an electoral advantage. You can't use a national emergency for electoral advantage. And I don't think his pep talk has done anything to dampen the growing problems. The problems are quite well expressed. It is a problem of a rise of extremism on both sides of the coin. And the threat that this poses to democratic elections. And, you have to be mindful of Joe Cox. And it's, the threat to people campaigning is real. And if that threat continues to grow, that destroys our democratic system, because people can't campaign without fear. And we have to fight against that. But as I say, I don't think the Prime Minister's pep talk was in the right place, in the right language, in the right way. And I think he was wrong. I think he was morally wrong. I think he was politically foolish. And I think it is right to call him out.